What a great, rich time we've had already this morning. Thanks for the meditation and the songs and the readings and the kids teaching. Feeling grateful to be here. This is the last week of a 3-week series that I'm doing on Jesus, what I call the American Jesus. And I've already mentioned sort of 4 Jesuses to keep in mind. The American Jesus, the Jesus of church history, which is very diverse, the historical Jesus, and what I was calling the mystical Christ, or even Christ consciousness. And that's the kind of thing that I'm sort of probing around in, at least attempting to. And I had all kinds of teachings available as I was thinking about this week. I just made a list. What's some unfinished business that I maybe feel like I want to talk about with Jesus? And so the list was very long. And I don't know, there was something going on. There's something going on in our culture that was drawing me back to this passage of his, where he says, "Do not worry about your life." Mainly because almost everything in our mainstream culture is communicating the opposite. Particularly if you turn on the news and it says all the time, "alert," in the right-hand corner, or "breaking news," or "this just in," and I'm like, oh my God, what is it? Doesn't really strike me as a culture of do not worry about your life. So anyway, I find that, by the way, teaching troubling and challenging, and I wonder what Jesus is talking about. What is transcendent about that? Even if you're not like sort of a Jesus follower or something like that, or a Christian, what sort of transcendent or cosmic layers are in here? One of the things that I haven't made explicit that I want to now before I continue actually again comes from Ken Wilber, which I talked about a couple weeks ago. So Ken Wilber says something. He says that when a consciousness shifts or changes, and he's got his own map of what that looks like, sort of stages or states or memes. And I mentioned sort of a version of it already a couple weeks ago: egocentric to ethnocentric to world-centric to ecocentric. That's just one version. But he says one of the unique things about how this kind of evolution happens is that it involves a process, and you've probably heard the phrase, of transcending and including. Have you heard that phrase before? I just gave it to you, now you have. He says healthy development always involves transcending and including. So yes, there's transcending, there's moving, for example, from egocentric consciousness to ethnocentric consciousness. That's movement, that's transcending, but it also involves including. How do we know that? Because you are a complicated, living organism as a human being. You have transcended the single cell, yet you are made up of single cells. Do you see how you're including and transcending? So it's built into the very structure of reality itself. Which, when you start thinking about stages or states or levels of consciousness, whatever kind of language you'd like to use, oftentimes we treat it as I've transcended that old thing that needs to be forgotten, dismantled, destroyed, ignored, blamed, and mocked. I'm definitely not that, we say, because I'm so transcendent, I'm nearly the Buddha, So I take that as a challenge. I mean, personally, especially when I think about my own Christian past. I don't want to include. Let's just stick with transcendence, So that's one reason why I wanted to talk about the cosmic Christ. Because I think it's worth asking, what needs to be included? Maybe not just from Jesus, but from the whole perennial tradition, the whole wisdom tradition. What needs to be included? Because we live in a culture that definitely worships the future and progress and what's coming, and technology will save us. And I mean, you can't possibly take anything your parents said seriously, much more your grandparents. And whatever is new must be breaking news, the thing we need. And we're definitely forgetting what's come before. And so that's one reason why I wanted to do a series on Jesus. What needs to be included? And not everything gets included, by the way. In systems, in evolutionary systems, things go away. You know, just like a meadow, a species might come into existence and go away, or an invasive plant might thrive for a while, but then in a self-regulating whole, things go away. So not everything is included, but some things are. And I think that I take that as a challenge, especially in a culture gone mad. And my tendency is to say, then, religion is such a problem, let's just ignore the whole thing. At what cost from a spiritual, deeper level? So that's one reason why I'm talking about these things. Transcend and include. What needs to be included? And I find this teaching of Jesus, and I'll give it to you if I can remember it all. I made little footnotes. So here's the teaching. Do not worry about your life. Do not worry about your life, he says. What you will eat, what you will drink, and what you will wear. Which pretty much sums up our culture, right? Do not worry about your life, what you will eat, what you will drink, what you will wear. Is not life more important than food? And the body more important than clothes? He goes on. He says, consider the birds of the air. So he gives like a solution almost. If you're caught up in worry, which I'm sure none of you are. Consider the birds of the air. Think about them. Consider them. Like observe them. What are they like? Consider the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns or in 401ks. Yet, and this is Jesus' metaphor or symbol or image, your heavenly Father feeds them. That's his vision of a sacred universe. They do not store away in barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. And then he says, consider the lilies of the field, the flowers, basically. They do not labor or spin, yet not even Solomon, in all of his splendor, was dressed like one of these. Which is here today and tomorrow is gone. That's some challenging imagery as an alternative to worry. He also adds a few things. He says, who of you, by worrying, can add a single hour to her life? Or to his life? Who of you, by worrying, can add a single hour? So there's something about the kind of craving that comes with the sort of worry I think that Jesus is describing. So do not worry, saying, what shall we drink? What shall we eat? What shall we wear? For the pagans run after these things. Leslie asked me a good question. What do you think he means by pagans? I'm not exactly sure. I think it's a kind of picture of Greco-Roman decadence. It's kind of would be my summary. The pagans, the dominant culture. By the way, Jesus said all these things, do not worry about your life, as basically what we would call a peasant, a day laborer. In other words, the poor. There were only two classes in the ancient world, the haves and the have-nots. There was not a middle class. Did you know that? No middle class. It's just everyone on the bottom of society and then the people on the top. And Jesus is not in the top, and he still says, don't worry about your life. It'd be different if he was like living large. Hey, don't worry. But he's not, apparently. And neither are any of his followers or just the ordinary people that are around him. It seems to be the case. So do not worry, saying, what shall we eat? What shall we drink? What shall we wear? Then he gives this famous line, which I'm sure you've heard. But seek first his kingdom. Or first he says, God knows you need all these things. Eating, drinking, clothes, by the way. Seek first his kingdom. This stuff will be given to you. And then he says, do not worry about tomorrow, for today has enough trouble of its own. Do not worry about tomorrow, for today has enough trouble of its own. It's funny that in Christianity, we've done almost nothing but worry about the future. Like, particularly where we're going to go and where other people are definitely not going to be joining us and go somewhere else. So do not worry about tomorrow. That sounds a lot like Eckhart Tolle. That's why I wanted to start with that. quotation this morning. So I find this a provocative and challenging teaching. I don't think you can hear this and just say, it's not really much there. I think there's something there. There's something there, and particularly in our culture of worry, anxiety, fear, scarcity. That's the kind of world that we live in. And we definitely live in a world that runs after eating, drinking, and clothing. Especially if we think about that in a more decadent sense. More. What shall we eat? What shall we drink? What shall we wear? Who's wearing what? We have whole television shows that are committed to what other people are wearing. Look what they're wearing. I mean, look at the sequins. They don't line up with the earrings or whatever. It's a craving. That's kind of what I'm getting at. And so Jesus says, think about birds. Consider them. Consider the way they go about life. So that's what I'm going to try to do this morning. Think about some of these things. So let's talk a bit about a culture of eating, drinking, and wearing. And I was thinking about this sort of egocentric notion of mine. I was paying attention to the way I talk about my life and the way other people talk about life. Notice how many times you refer to what you think you possess. Like, hey, where's my phone? Like, it's my phone. Even though technically, wait, is it my phone? Actually, as I think about it, I'm renting my phone. It's not even mine. My house, I live in my house. Is it my house? Or does the bank own the house? And if the bank owns the house, what does that mean? And or even my kids or my spouse. What do you mean exactly by my? You own them? They're your possession? Or my clothes. Like, these are my clothes. I bought these clothes. Last week, I did a load of laundry, and I forgot about some chapstick in my pocket. I was like, I've ruined my clothes. It's really an idiotic thing to do. I have no point to that. I just thought of it. Don't worry. Thanks. Appreciate that. That's what Jesus meant. Don't worry if you ruin your own clothes with chapstick. Yeah, but it's a possessiveness. My house, my car, my 401k, my life, my retirement, my kids, my spouse. Do you hear how dominant that is? And we live in a culture that definitely bows down at that altar. My property. I read an article about the largest landowner in Texas, and I was really quite amazed. I was like, wow, they own a lot of land. But how do you own land? I mean, I understand. I'm not trying to take down the whole economic system that props up our illusory world. But I'm saying, how do you own land? How do you own it? I mean, how do I own my property? It's a made-up, artificial construct that is essentially an illusion on the level of the soul. Consider the birds of the air. Do they own anything at all? Oh, this is my nest. Damn good nest, but next year, wait till I upgrade, and I get an even bigger nest so that I can have a bigger nest, Get off my branch. This is my branch. No two branches are the same to Wren. Isn't that what David Wagner says? Anyway, so a culture of mind and a culture of decadence. I've been listening on audio actually to a Margaret Wheatley book called Who Do I Choose to Be? Highly recommend it. I'll be quoting from it for the next 6 months. So she one of the things that she describes in this book is how empires collapse. And they tend to go in about these 250-year cycles. Hint, hint. And it's very well researched. And one of the things that seems to be a major pattern among empire collapse is near the end of the collapse. First of all, people become very egocentric. What is mine? They want to be entertained. And they worship, what does she say exactly? They worship actors athletes, and there's one more, which I can't find. I did write it down, so it'll get. Oh, musicians. Athletes, actors, and musicians. By the way, I'm not, you think I'm talking about the United States. I am. and our culture in general. But this is a pattern. This is a pattern. Yeah, and I'm going to say something and you're going to get mad, some of you, so I'm sorry. I'm just giving you permission to be angry. That's fine. So a few weeks ago, all of a sudden, it's sort of breaking news, alert, alert, alert. Let's have Oprah as the next president. So I thought, that's interesting. In a culture that worships celebrities, I just find it interesting that we put in the United States a celebrity, a television personality into the White House. And our solution is to get another celebrity. And I'm not saying if that's good or bad, or if she'd make a good president, bad president. I'm just saying, interesting solution. When you live in a culture that worships celebrities, actors, musicians, and athletes, the solution to the celebrity is a different one. I'm just saying. I don't know what I'm saying. Just okay, so yeah, in a culture running after eating, drinking, wearing, decadence, what is going on? And what might the birds have to teach us? Consider the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns. So yeah, just some basic observations about birds and flowers that seem to offer a bit of an alternative view of the landscape. First of all, the life of a bird, the life of a flower is cyclical. Correct? There's a cycle, there's a pattern, it's a seasonal kind of orientation. They do things at certain times of year. If they're migratory, they move. If they're not, they do different things during different seasons. It's cyclical, which already, I think, is maybe a little bit of a seed that can help us when we think about worrying. Because things come and go. Seasons come and go. Things pass away and new things are born in the world. The flowers die. And yet the following spring, something of them comes back. So there's a kind of, I think, broad observation. If you're really going to consider the birds, is life like that? Or is it really just a progressive train, the train of progress, and we're trucking along, and in an industrial growth society, the only possibility for hope is growth, right? I mean, that's what, well, the economy needs to grow by this and that, even the tax cuts. If the economy grows by this, then we'll be able to pay for this. That train cannot go forever. How do we know that? Because every empire that is built upon the basic system collapses. Why? Because maybe there's something to life that is cyclical. Things have to go into the ground. Things have to pass away. So there's something of that, I think, that's just worth noting. And also, everything in nature is completely interdependent. We somehow are the only species that think we're not related to everything else that's happening. We stand outside of that. We have the Department of Natural Resources, meaning they're resources for our own myth of progress. So maybe there's something about the natural cycles and rhythms that communicates our interdependence, which is exactly the image of the bird. Jesus says, they don't sow or reap or store away in your barns, yet your heavenly Father, that's the image of the divine, I think, feeds them. Not like a puppeteer, but because everything is interrelated. They have what they need. And that's a kind of challenge, I mean, even to our own human minds. Do we have what we need? Or is there not enough? And that's the thing I think that's being probed. The the difference between the bird is that it's not, apparently, thinking about scarcity. There's not enough. There's not enough twigs in the world for me to make my nest. So I better hoard all the twigs for 10 years so that I can die with a pile of twigs. I don't know. I think that's so everything is dependent. Maybe you've heard of the Buddhist notion of dependent co-arising. You heard of this phrase, dependent co-arising? So all things are dependent and connected and co-arise together. That's a very different notion of the world than I have resources and I use them for my benefit to go in a particular direction. All things are interrelated. And now we know this. This might have been a Buddhist insight that came before the time of Jesus, and now we know this thanks to contemporary physics. We don't even actually know how interdependent all things are. We're just starting to bump into this vortex of mystery. How interrelated and interdependent are all things? I think just on the mystical level, this teaching is pointing us back toward a much more interrelated, self-organizing, mystical kind of view of the world. By the way, I remembered as I was thinking about the birds, consider the birds. Have you ever read the book Black Elk Speaks? It's very cool. He's talking about the circle in there. He's like, the circle is the nature of reality. How do we know? Because he says, I've been told that the earth is a circle. I just love that he says, I've been told that the earth is a circle. And he says, and the sun is a circle, and the moon is a circle, and the seasons are a circle. See how non-linear that is? And he says, and the birds make their nests in a circle, for their religion is the same as ours. That's someone who has considered the birds. What would it mean what would it mean to learn something from the religion of the birds who make their nests in a circle? Who are embodying the cyclical nature of all reality, perhaps. So there's something about the birds, and also something about presence, which is what I was saying before. That's why Jesus says, don't store away in barns. Or think about the lilies of the field, which are here today and tomorrow are thrown into the fire, which is kind of like, whoa. Which is another way of saying, you're going to die. You're going to die. You too, and I am. Something that co-arises by some profound mystery and goes into the earth. You're that too. We don't like to think about that. It's, by the way, one of the oldest practices that seems to be across many different religious traditions to contemplate and think about one's own death. But in the Western world, we've been trained to ignore it at all costs. Correct? We even say things, at funerals that they're not really dead, except they're not alive, except that one piece. And there's something precious then about existence. And think about the anxiety again of eating, drinking, wearing, clothes, tucking away, scarcity, the clinging, the gripping. Just consider the lilies. You're here and then you're not. Yeah, that's a sobering and also precious consciousness, I think. So Jesus is poking around in. So I think my question starts to become, how do you embody such a thing? That's really, I hear do not worry and I think, okay, so what am I going to concentrate on not worrying? Then I'm going to end up worrying about the fact that I'm worrying, or did I worry? And then You seem to be in like this mental trap that you can't get out of, which is maybe why Jesus kind of pivots toward the birds. Like, it's not just about not doing something. So what is it about? How does one live with more abundance? How does one live with more joy? When I think about Christ consciousness, that's what I would call it at its most mystical level. I think the Christ or Christ consciousness seems to embody love. That's what I would say. Where maybe the Buddha embodies non-attachment or enlightenment or something as that particular expression of the mystery. But with Christ, I think it's love, Christ consciousness, and love in the sense of embracing of the other, maybe of the interconnectedness of all of reality. A good image of that is just Jesus touching lepers, or eating with crazy people and drunks, and that was his cultural way of expressing these things. That all things are included in this the Christ consciousness of love. And that's what's so funny about the American Jesus, because I don't think anyone even, stop a Christian on the street and say, "What's Jesus about?" They might pretty quickly be able to get to love. Wouldn't you agree? But if you think about the embodiment of the American Jesus, I mean, that's kind of a joke, really. Love of what? Love of our tribe is what it often feels like. Love of our way of life, our rights, which gets down to me, my way of life, and a kind of personal ticket to some afterlife, which seems kind of absurd. But so how does one, that was my point, how does one begin to embody such a thing? And the truth is, I don't know. I don't know. Other than if maybe to begin to do our own bit of considering. What is our view of reality? What is our view of nature? What is if I were to walk outside, like yesterday I went to Lake Michigan. Have you heard of this place? It's not too far. And I was like, almost, I was moved by the wildness of the lake. If I were to stand there in July and someone were to describe what the landscape looks like in the middle of January, I would not believe them, had I not seen it myself. Which is very humbling, I think, in a way. And what if I could give myself over to what nature itself has to teach me about what's important, about the cyclical nature of reality itself, and the humility involved in allowing oneself to be a member of the landscape. If anyone were to put me on one of those little ice islands and say, "All right, show me what you got," I mean, I would freak out like you have never seen. And that is how precious life is in terms of our ability to control. Yet we come back and we think, mine, mine, mine. How can I be safe? So I think Jesus is poking around in some of these things. One of the things that Margaret Wheatley suggests as an image in this book that I've been listening to is she says, what we need are islands of sanity, which sounds about right. Islands of sanity. I love that image because it's communal. When so much of our culture is egotistic, mine, an island of sanity is a communal image. We need islands of sanity. And here's a question she asks, how do we not add to the fear and anxiety? How do we not add? And I mean we, and I mean the people in this room. How do we not add to this? So when I think about how do you embody a teaching like do not worry, I think, first of all, we have to start thinking more communally. We need one another to not add to the fear, anxiety, worry, depression, and scarcity. And we're going to have to remind one another. We're going to have to remind one another of our preciousness. Jesus also says you cannot make one hair white or black. You can't do it. Well, I mean, you can go to the salon, I suppose. But that's just covering up something, correct? I'm not against that, by the way. Don't. No threatening letters. But we're going to have to remind one another. And so here are some invitations. When I think about this move, this shift that I think Jesus is pointing the way towards. So how do we move in an island of sanity from being a consumer to being a participant? That's what I think. Consumer to being a participant. That's a big shift. It's a huge shift. So how do I consume? One of my friends, I thought this was such an interesting challenge with his kids. He said, okay, you consume a lot of videos, like YouTube videos. Be a maker of YouTube videos. Be a participant. Do you feel the shift already? From consuming to participation. So I think that's something in here. So that's a move from consumer to participant, from taking to giving. That's what I think the embodiment of such a teaching like this looks like. From taking, mine. What are we going to eat? What are we going to drink? What am I going to wear? To giving, to abundance. What about from extracting to nourishing? Extraction is so cold, isn't it? I get this thing out of the ground and it's mine. What about a question like, what nourishes? All things on one level are a kind of extraction. Even if you're like, hey, I'm just like living off the land. Yeah, but you just killed a snail, you know? But the move, I think, is from extraction to, I think, nourishing is a word I like. From mine to ours. Think how different the world would be. And how do we do that? I don't think we can do that by voting that into place. I think an island of sanity that begins to embody that is about the only thing that we can hope for, from mine to ours. From separation to integration. From I to us. From America first to planet first. But how? I think by helping one another. Not add to the fear, anxiety, and confusion. And guess who stands ready to aid us in this shift in consciousness? Birds, flowers, ice, sand, sun, nests, for their religion is the same as ours. Thanks for listening.